Today, the Holocaust speaks primarily through its voices. I mean, to begin with, the tens of thousands of survivors who speak directly into the camera, giving testimony for the Spielberg and Fortunoff archives, not to mention the 220 hours of unseen footage from Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah, now available from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and going all the way back to the audio tapes of Holocaust survivors interviewed by David Boder in the DP camps. So too the voices of the perpetrators who faced their accusers at the major war trials, starting at Nuremberg. And finally, most recently, the voices of Jews suspected of collaborating with the enemy, who were put on trial in so-called honor courts that were held in Poland and in the State of Israel. By learning how to listen to the voices of the victims, perpetrators, bystanders, and suspected collaborators, our generation has greatly honed its listening skills. And if we miss something, we can pause, rewind, or flash forward. By honing these listening skills, we are now in a position to complete the great unfinished business of Holocaust studies, to cross the temporal and cognitive divide between war and peace, the living and the dead. We can move back in time and place so that we can hear what was spoken inside the occupied war zone and in the countries that mobilized to fight the war. So doing, we will be able at long last to hear the voices of the Holocaust's first responders, the Holocaust's first witnesses, to hear how they grappled with their situation and the collapse of the world as they knew it. These voices from out of the Holocaust proper expressed themselves in several different modes. They spoke as wartime diarists, Anne Frank, Chaim Kaplan, Victor Klemperer, Etty Hillesum, Emanuel Ringelblum, Hermann Kruk. They spoke as wartime poets, Paul Celan, Miklos Radnoti, Władysław Schlengel, Yitzchak Katzenelson, Simcha Bunim-Shayevich, Avram Sutzkever, Yankiv Gladstein, Hay Leivik, Natan Alterman, Uri Tzvi Greenberg. They spoke as wartime singers and performers in the ghettos and concentration camps. They spoke as wartime journalists like Peretz Opochinsky and Yosef Zelkovich, reporting from the ghettos. And most remarkably, they spoke as wartime chroniclers, giving documentary evidence from Auschwitz-Birkenau, like Zalman Gradovsky and other members of the Sonderkommando. They, in turn, can be heard through four modes of listening: historically, forensically, psychologically, and culturally. The art of listening to wartime voices has already produced some remarkable results. So here is Alexandra Garbini's work called Numbered Days, Diaries and the Holocaust, which examines the historical implications. Thanks to Sam Kassos, Who Will Write Our History, Emanuel Ringelblum and the Warsaw Ghetto and the Onyx Shabbos archive, we know how these voices were assembled and what they were supposed to speak to us and say. Listening forensically, we have this book by Tom Lampert, who pieced together the wartime lives of 7 people and 1 dog who were victims, perpetrators, and collaborators. And he did it on the basis of archival sources and court transcripts, almost without any authorial intrusion. The performers in the ghetto are studied here by Gilla Flam in Singing for Survival, Songs of the Lodz Ghetto. Or this book, Theatrical Performance During the Holocaust, put together by Rebecca Rovit and Alvin Goldfarb. In today's lecture, I too shall focus on the first responders and witnesses. But I shall do so by introducing a fifth mode of listening. Listening anthologically. Anthologies give voice to those living inside the occupied war zone, whose days were numbered, and those living in the free zone who witnessed the countdown from afar. The strategic advantage of anthologies in wartime is that they were already familiar. They had a long lineage, and they came in different shapes and sizes. So, as we learn from the anthology in Jewish literature, David Stern's excellent collection of essays, anthologies have served the Jewish people well as a medium for the transmission, preservation, and creation of tradition. So just think of the Siddur or the Passover Haggadah, right? And in modern times, anthologies became an agent in the creation or recreation of Jewish culture and community. Think of this amazing book, the Book of Legends, Sefer HaAgadah by Bialik and Revnitsky. Wartime anthologies, as we shall see, spoke in three distinct ways, mixing and matching the one and the many, the individual and the collective. Sometimes it was one voice speaking on behalf of the many. Sometimes it was a collective speaking in many voices, and sometimes a collective, a band of brothers, speaking in one voice. So to broaden the scope of our inquiry into the Jewish anthological imagination in wartime, allow me to recommend this meta-anthology from the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. This volume is organized geographically and also by genre, and each of the 5 chapters begins with the genre of anthologies. Chapter 1, Catastrophe, 1939 to 45, opens with wartime anthologies, including some that I will discuss. And like all volumes in the Posen Library, it is now accessible online. You just have to register to the Posen Library and you can have it. Because we don't yet have an inventory of Jewish anthologies that were produced during the Second World War, whatever conclusions we draw must remain tentative. So here's something we can already say with confidence from the get-go. In wartime, anthologies were not an antiquarian pursuit, a custodial activity. Today, in 2021, in year 2 of the global pandemic, the person speaking to you is much older than the oldest person in our story. Dr. Oscar Rosenfeld was 59 when he wrote the introduction to the Encyclopedia of the Lodz Ghetto. In August 44, shortly after his 60th birthday, he was deported to Auschwitz, where he was immediately put to death in a gas chamber. By contrast, the chronology of our story, which spans the entire war, is defined by its youngest anthologizers. Antek Zuckerman was 25 years old when he co-authored Pein und Gwure in Jiddischen Over in Licht von Gegenwart, a 101-page mimeographed anthology that appeared in the summer of 1940, 3 months before the Warsaw Ghetto was officially sealed. Avrom Levitt was 28 on the 3rd of January 1945, when he finished writing the introduction to the Auschwitz anthology, composed by Jewish prisoners within Auschwitz itself. Aided by their youth, both Zuckerman and Levitt survived. Whether they were young or middle-aged, the editors of these anthologies had no time to lose and no paper to waste. This was not a job for sedentary scholars in retirement. So, we begin with the most typical form of anthologies, what the British call miscellanies, which draw upon historical literary sources from far and wide. In both, the anthological form is the message, because the purpose of ingathering these sources is to produce a usable past and a blueprint for the future. One of them came out of Warsaw, and the other, Milwaukee. So in the summer of 1940, Antek Zuckerman partnered with an older colleague, 40-year-old Elio Gutkowski, to produce an anthology in 400 mimeographed copies on behalf of the Zionist movement Dror, and it was called Suffering and Heroism in the Jewish Past in Light of the Present. History shows us that we are a great people, great in our suffering and in our desire to live, they wrote in the introduction to the volume. Such a people can be oppressed, but it cannot perish. So what was the point of rehearsing Jewish suffering and martyrdom? Was it merely to show that the Jews were a long-suffering people and as such could withstand the present onslaught as well? Well, if so, such anthologies weren't anything new. Back in the 1920s, Shimon Berenfeld published a 3-volume anthology called Sefer HaDema'ot, the Book of Tears, which covered Jewish responses to persecution from Antiochus Epiphanes to the Haidamach revolt in the Ukraine at the end of the 18th century. So what was new about the present collection? What was new was the emphasis on self-defense. Zuckerman and Gutkowski gave equal weight to heroism as to suffering. And the selections were pretty much equally divided between medieval and modern sources. So we hear the voices of the chroniclers and liturgical poets from the Crusades. We hear chroniclers of the Khmelnytsky massacres, Nosonot Hanover, Shabtai HaKohen. We have historical poetry, fiction, and drama by Shaul Chernichovsky, Sholem Asch, Nikolai Minsky. The voices in poetry and prose of Brenner, Bialik, Achad Ha'am, Nachman Sirkin, and above all, the voice of the Hebrew expressionist poet Yitzchak Lamdan. The anthology is punctuated by 4 selections from Lamdan's epic-making poem Masada in Yiddish translation. Now, let me remind you that Masada was an historical narrative that the rabbis had forced underground. In 1927, Lamdan resurrected this forgotten episode to signify the last outpost of Jewish political sovereignty and turning it into a flashpoint of Jewish armed resistance. Masada shall never fall again was its central message. So, in Nazi-occupied Warsaw, the voices of medieval Jewish chroniclers and liturgical poets, Zionist thinkers, modern Yiddish and Hebrew and Russian poets, prose writers, and playwrights all met for the first time, anthologically, to voice their support of Jewish resistance to persecution and oppression. To make history, the young Zionist underground would have to know history. Now, what voices could speak to American Jews who were becoming fully integrated, but now felt themselves to be under siege? Anti-Semitism was on the rise, and so was isolationism. Never had American Jews felt more insecure. And so it was in December 1942 that Rabbi Joseph L. Barron of Milwaukee completed his third and most ambitious anthology to date. He called it Stars and Sand, and he drew the title from the book of Genesis. The proof text appears on the title page. So let me read it to you. And the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham and said, I will multiply thy seed as the stars in heaven, and as the sand on the shore of the sea. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. To convince his readers that this covenantal promise made on Mount Moriah was still valid, Barron brought as witnesses all the nations on earth, or as the flyleaf promised, more than 700 of the world's foremost statesmen, religious authorities, philosophers, and artists, beginning with Themistius and Augustine and ending with Churchill and Roosevelt, voice through the pages of this book their appreciation of Israel's glorious tradition and their sympathy with Israel's heroic struggles. So, the voice of God's angel was here replaced by the voices of more than 700 non-Jewish notables who held the Jews in high esteem, not just now, but through all the ages. Their expression of philo-Semitism was brought together from scores of languages and from national literatures of 44 lands. Here were 555 densely printed pages, richly illustrated, and put out by the Jewish Publication Society in 1943, that went into a second printing the next year. So, as an example of Barron's anthological reach, here is what Joseph Stalin has to say about the Jews, drawn from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. I'm just going to read you the first and last passage from this amazing quotation. Says Stalin, anti-Semitism as an extreme form of race chauvinism is the most dangerous survival of cannibalism. In the USSR, anti-Semitism is strictly prosecuted as a phenomenon hostile to the Soviet system. According to the laws of the USSR, active anti-Semites are punished with death. At a time when most of Europe was still under Nazi domination, Barron's League of Jewish-Friendly Nations could foster what he called a broadened sense of human kinship. The anthological form was the message, because only by spanning 2 millennia and by surveying the entire Western world could such a broad coalition of pro-Jewish sentiment be assembled. Only in anthological form could there be such an imagined community of non-Jewish notables who embraced the cause of the persecuted, embattled Jews. And only in America. Listening anthologically, we can span both sides of the war, both what was published underground and above ground, from Warsaw to Milwaukee and beyond. Listening anthologically, we can hear the cumulative effect of voices mobilized to combat hatred, apathy, fear, and despair? What voices could speak to the first witnesses and responders in the present hour? For Zionist youth, cut off from the Yishuv and from the rest of the Jewish world, it was the voice of martyrs and fighters from the distant and recent past. For Jews desperate to feel at home in America, it was the voice of tolerance and solidarity across time and Western civilization. Now, small though the Hebrew-speaking community in Mandatory Palestine was relative to diaspora Jewry at large, it was effectively organized by political affiliation. Or to put it differently, if you didn't belong to one or another political party, you couldn't get a job, and you certainly couldn't get published. The intellectual giant of the Labour Party at that critical moment in time was Beryl Katzenelson, whom everyone called Beryl. And it was his decision to establish a major publishing venue called Am Oved, the People of Labor, that was to change the literary map of the war. Given a carte blanche as editor-in-chief by Mapai, Beryl decided to dedicate a separate library to raising the Yishuv's consciousness about the world at war. Appropriately, he called it Min HaMoked, from the fire, and he appointed Bracha Chabas, one of the first women journalists in the Yishuv, to run with it. Presumably, it was Chabas who put together the following prospectus, and it appears on the back cover of every volume. Not only does it describe the ambitious scope of this anthological project as a whole, we can read it today as an inventory of what we now call the literature of the Holocaust and the literature of World War II. So the categories are memoirs of victims of Nazism and fascism, authentic eyewitness accounts from the ghettos and concentration camps, tales of refugees and the travails of survivors, documents from the resistance in the underground, works of the soldiers in uniform, the fates of nations and states in the war, how the war against the enemy is proceeding, and finally, deliberations on what is to come. So here, as early as 1943, was a comprehensive checklist of the voices that could speak to the educated Hebrew reader who wished to understand both the fate of the nations and the fate of the Jews. So, in addition to commissioning translations from English, French, Russian, Polish, Yiddish, and then some, 21 volumes in all, that would help situate the Yishuv within the global war effort, Chabas edited her own anthologies. And they were designed to provide authentic eyewitness accounts from the ghettos and concentration camps. The first was called Kol Demei Achim, the voice of the blood of the brothers. In 1943, it was drawn mostly from reports published in her own newspaper Davar, a miscellany of journalism and eyewitness accounts, and Michtavim Min HaGetaot, 250 letters documenting the life and death struggle of Zionist youth under Nazi occupation. These were letters written mostly in German, some in Polish, French, English, and even in rudimentary Hebrew. So here's what she writes in the introduction. From these letters rise the desperate calls that knocked on the heart of the world and in our hearts, the bold attempts to cross borders, to save and to be saved, the majesty of Jewish girls who took upon themselves the mission that fate had assigned them, the tireless covert endeavor to acquire weapons, to plan a last and desperate uprising. All this is revealed in between the lines of these brief, ordinary letters written in coded phrases by inexperienced underground resistance fighters. So Chabas, of course, didn't invent this form. Her implicit model were last letters from the front, in such collections as Kriegsbriefe deutscher Studenten, letters of German students who perished on the front in the First World War, or letters of fallen German Jews published in Berlin in 1935. They were all male, all young, and all killed in defense of the motherland. Here, many were written by young women. Most of their identities could not be revealed, for unlike fallen soldiers, if they were still alive, their identities had to be protected. Only the names of those known to have perished could now be made public. But their number, as Chabas explained, kept growing with each passing day. One of them, who could definitely be named, was Tosia Altman. She was a leader of the Zionist youth movement Hashomer HaTzair. Tosia was one of the fighters thought to have perished in the bunker on Mila 18. Her last letter, however, was anything but a battle cry of freedom. I think you'll agree, she writes to an unidentified addressee living on kibbutz, that one shouldn't draw strength from a poisoned well. I am trying to control myself, not to vent the bitterness that has accumulated against you and your friends for having forgotten us so utterly. I blame you that you didn't help me with a few words at least. But today, I don't want to settle my accounts with you. It was the recognition and certainty that we will never see each other again that impelled me to write. And this is where her voice and substance changes. As she explains in code, in cryptic language, the systematic murder of the Jews. When she uses the word Israel, it's not the individual, it's code for the people of Israel, the Jews of Eastern Europe. But what can be done? This is how things are. I am doing everything to prevent it and to save the person who is most dear to me. But unfortunately, there are factors that block the strongest will. Israel is vanishing before my eyes, and I wring my hands, and I cannot help him. Have you ever tried to smash a wall with your head? Tosia Altman's farewell letter attacked the silent complicity of those living in freedom. And it struck a nerve. Her letter was read aloud by the poet Yitzhak Lamdan, the same Lamdan who had written Masada 16 years earlier, at a parlor meeting of the Al Domi, the Do Not Be Silent group held in Jerusalem. And after reading Altman's letter out loud, Lamdan read an anguished mea culpa in reply. So, last letters such as these, which made their first appearance in 1943, gave those living outside the occupied war zone an immediate, terrifying sense of what was really happening inside. Such letters were scandalous because their publication had come too late. Now, one shouldn't exaggerate the impact that these first responders from the free zone and first witnesses from the war zone had on the collective psyche of the Yishuv. Investing so much effort in translating, collecting, editing, and publishing a library of war-related paperbacks did not translate into sales. Beryl admitted as much in a letter that he wrote shortly before he died in 1944. But Letters from the Ghettos, Michtavim min HaGetaot, is more than an historical artifact. Listening anthologically, we hear a collective dialogue, 250 voices from across the entire occupied war zone speaking to their direct counterparts in the land of Israel. We hear one war zone speaking to another. Listening anthologically, we hear the voices of a Jewish war that was raging on multiple fronts simultaneously: physical, moral, and psychological. Now, thus far, the anthological voices we have been listening to were assembled by individual editors. The anthologies of Zuckerman and Gutkovsky and Barron and Chabas were composite voices orchestrated by a directorial hand. The editors of these anthologies worked both backwards and forwards. They worked backwards to decide who was in and who was out, what to include and what not to include. And they worked forwards towards a community of readers in the present moment or in some imagined future. Listening anthologically, however, we can also hear the voice of a collective writing as a collective. And such collective compositions make different demands of us as listeners. They require that we listen polyphonically. This brings us to the Jews of Lodz. The Jews of Lodz, both those who had rebuilt their lives in America and those who were rounded up into a ghetto in April of 1940 when Lodz was renamed Landsmanshaft and was annexed to the German Reich. Unbeknownst to one another, each group of Lodzer Jews embarked upon an anthological project. Each was a collective endeavor, an ingathering of individual voices that were designed to be more than the sum of their individual parts. Listening anthologically, we hear two groups of first responders and first witnesses to the Holocaust who spoke the same language but could not have been more different. America was home to a new form of affiliation at the grassroots level called the Landsmanshaft, the Hometown Association. Every self-respecting town and city in the old country had its own Landsmanshaft in the new, and every year there would be a grand reunion, usually a banquet, at which anniversary journals were handed out in celebration of the great collective effort and a successful year of fundraising. These journals, which are a staple of Jewish communal life in America until this very day, were full of smiling faces and advertisements, right? So here they are, the smiling faces. Landsleit, as a rule, read the Yiddish press and had family and friends in Europe. So it's no wonder that they were among the first responders to the Holocaust. One Louis Oppert was particularly active in the United Emergency Relief Committee for the city of Lodz. As he himself tells it, he and two other members of the Lodz Landsmanshaft, one woman and one man, got together in March of 1940 to assemble and publish a Yizker book, a memorial volume for their beloved home that was being destroyed. The proceeds from this volume were to aid the survivors once the war was over. So this is the Lodger Yisker book. Oppert's introductory chapter to the Yisker book is full of apologies. Why the book took 3 years to produce. Why the self-portrait of Jewish Lodge was far from comprehensive. Because all contact with Lodge, now the German city of Landsmanshaft Landsmanstadt had been cut off, why it was so difficult to glean first-hand information about the fate of their brothers and sisters. The medium of the Lodge Yisker book, therefore, was its mixed message. The first thing that we see when we open the book is this. It's a commissioned work of art by the then famous Lodge-born artist, Arthur Schick. It's a, if you will, a split screen illustration that shows a German bayonet thrust through the Lodge municipal coat of arms above, and the grieving heads of 3 Polish Jews, an elderly bearded man, his kerchiefed wife, and their very young son below. I'm sorry to report that this artwork was ripped out of the copy at the New York Public Library and is therefore also missing from the Yiddish Book Center digital copy. This artwork is followed by the history of the Jews of Lodz, however fragmentary, made up mostly of memoirs and biographical sketches. This is followed by the fate of Lodz Jewry since the German occupation, pieced together from disparate sources and eyewitness accounts. Only at the very end of this section is there a chapter called Churban Lodz by the journalist and refugee Yankiv Kirschboim. It contains precise facts and almost accurate figures about the systematic murder of Lodz Jewry in Chelmno and Auschwitz. 40,000 Jews, he reports, were gassed in Chelmno in the course of 50 days. What was done to their bodies before they were gassed and after they were gassed is also described in lurid detail. So, was this the overarching message of the Yisker book? Is this why they published it? Kirschbaum's devastating chapter, however, is followed seamlessly by reports on the activities of the various branches of the Lodge Landsmanshaft in America. And that's followed by a commemorative section printed in black borders. And finally, space ads, mostly in English, with lists of contributions to the volume as small as $1. So in memorial books published after the war, the pages with black borders would be reserved for the martyrs. Here, instead, the vast majority were for family members who had died in America of natural causes. So when you look at the book as a whole, the last 221 pages might just as well be an anniversary journal. Louis Oppert, for example, bought a quarter-page ad urging members to buy insurance policies from him. Just before the space ads, however, there are 3 pages of photos dedicated to the American-born sons of Lodz, who were now fighting in the United States Army, like Oppert's son, Corporal Morris Oppert, who enlisted in 1941 and was serving in Army intelligence in Fort Hamilton. Listening anthologically, the Yisker book reveals just how difficult it was for the Landsleute to admit the Holocaust into their consciousness. Listening anthologically, we hear the voice of a generation too old to enlist, but old enough to remember every street and courtyard in the home they left behind and might never see again. A generation caught between celebrating their American presence and commemorating their European destruction. By 1943, most of the 1,500 ghettos established by the Germans had already been liquidated. And in 1943 alone, these major ghettos were added to the list. Krakow, Warsaw, Białystok, Riga, Częstochow, Tarnów, Vilna, and Minsk. The Lodz ghetto, located in the Vartaland that had been annexed to the Reich, was the great exception. There, on December 1st, 1943, Dr. Oskar Rosenfeld, who had been deported to Lodz from Prague 2 years before, embarked upon an anthological project unique in the annals of wartime, the Encyclopedia of the Lodz Ghetto. This is how Rosenfeld laid out the rationale concisely and analytically, as befitted an eminent German Jewish intellectual. So I'll read it from the Posen anthology. A group of people living together under extreme coercive conditions, without the conscious intent of forming a community of common fate, created forms that were only possible on the basis of the ghetto. Everyday life required certain norms of work and existence. It created its own structure, its own language, its own terminology. Nowhere in the world was there a human community comparable to that of the ghetto. Forced to live under extreme conditions, thrown together from places near and far, speaking different languages, could this dystopia generate its own societal norms, its own economic structure, its own forms of communication? The encyclopedic medium was the message. Not only was such a world worthy of being memorialized, it would require a team of 10 encyclopedists, headed by Rosenfeld himself, to complete the task, to cover the ghetto from A to Z in 1,400 entries. A third of them have survived, almost all carrying the author's initials. And I'm happy to report that an English translation of the unfinished encyclopedia is available online, courtesy of the State Archive of Lodz and the University of Lodz. The initials make it possible to distinguish between one voice and another. So, like Rosenfeld, O.S., Dr. Oskar Singer, was also a deportee from Prague. He was a lawyer, dramatist, and journalist. Singer took a special interest in the realia of ghetto life and had something to say about each of the cigarette brands used in the ghetto. Ballerina, German brand of cigarettes produced in Landsmanshaft, originally of poor quality. However, as no alternatives were available, it became, so to speak, the prima ballerina of the tobacco department, and was then only at the disposal of the chairman. That means Rumkowski. Belgische Zigaretten, a large batch of extremely low-quality cigarettes imported from Belgium by the Ghetto Verwaltung encased in colorful packaging with frivolous names, all equally bad. They contained no trace of real tobacco. Children used the colorful packets for making playing cards. These were eagerly traded. So, the encyclopedic medium was the message in every sense, for each entry was crammed with social data, was a capsule of ghetto time, and sometimes betrayed the author's sensibility. It became, so to speak, the prima ballerina of the tobacco department was written tongue-in-cheek, right? And the afterlife of this ersatz tobacco among the children turned the whole subject into light comedy. So that's one voice. Jay-Z's, Yosef Zelkovich's tone was very different. As someone who had been living in Lodz and reporting on the city of Lodz for the Yiddish press since 1925, his entries were tinged with social satire. As when he explained the evolution of the meaning of the Yiddish-Turkish word Balagan. Please note that all of my examples begin with the letter B. Okay. Balagan. In the ghetto's unique conditions, the noun's meaning changed. It was used not only to describe the state of general disorder in the ghetto, but also a special kind of chaos and confusion observed at distribution points and among people waiting in lines. The word Balagan meant the front of such a line, comprised of a whole cluster of people crowding the entrance to the distribution point or at the counter window of the ration cards collection office. So those encyclopedists like Zelkovich and the Lodz-born mathematician and Yiddish teacher Yerachmiel Briman, JB, were schooled in Polish-Jewish life. When need be, they could begin an entry by taking a look backwards to before the ghetto. So in the entry on Benejorev, Sons of Sinai, for example, Briman traced its origins to pre-war Lodz. And I read, immediately after the ghetto was established, members of the Benejorev encouraged religious workers to observe the Sabbath. They also mediated at offices and other institutions when Sabbath observers were harassed. The second task members of the association set themselves was to teach orphaned children how to recite Kaddish. They would find orphans, lead them to prayer minyanim, and make sure the children said Kaddish for their parents. After the religious schools in the ghetto were officially closed, members of the association went from house to house and taught children there. They organized classes where instructors taught Hebrew and Jewish history and gave lectures on religious subjects. The association's office at 22 Wasevnitska Street was closed, but Benejorev did not stop its activities. Each Friday, the so-called mesibas, or parties, were organized in the apartments of different members. Tishan, or Hasidic meals, were held, and the children's choir performed traditional zmiris. Members of the school board would speak. On March 28, 1944, on the 5th anniversary of Benejorev, an official ceremony was held, attended by all the active members of the association. Compressed into 2 paragraphs are 5 years in the struggle of ghetto Jews to maintain religious discipline and Hasidic praxis, both for their own sake and for the benefit of children and orphans upon whom the future rested. Because the encyclopedists could still imagine a future, there was no need to explain the religious terminology of mesibas, zmiris, tishan, and the like. The Encyclopedia of the Lodz Ghetto assumed a reader thoroughly at home in Yiddish, Polish, and German. Listening anthologically, we eavesdrop on a conversation about ersatz, cigarettes, breadlines, and communal self-help. Listening anthologically, we hear the voices of a dystopic community forced into existence by an implacable enemy, yet determined to exploit every available venue of agency, whether social, economic, religious, or intellectual. Listening anthologically, we hear what no survivor testimony can offer. The voice of a collective speaking as a collective in real time. In this sense, the anthology was the perfect wartime medium. The war threw people together on the battlefield, on breadlines, in protest rallies, in bomb shelters, in ghettos, transports, appels, and on death marches, who would never have met otherwise. Groups of people, to paraphrase Oscar Rosenfeld, thrown together under wartime conditions, created forms that were made possible only in wartime. But the Jewish anthological imagination in the Holocaust did not end there. For the war was not yet over, and so long as there were survivors, there would be anthologies. What could poets do in time of catastrophe? To document the catastrophe using meter, rhyme, and metaphor? To resist through words? They could do both most effectively if they acted not alone, but as a band of brothers. That is what happened in 1944 when the work of 4 young Polish poets appeared in Warsaw, a city that was officially Judenrein after the ghetto uprising and after the ghetto was razed to the ground. Under the auspices of the Jewish National Committee, an umbrella group representing the Zionist parties and the Jewish Labor Bund, they produced the first anthology of Holocaust poetry in any language. 10 poems that appeared under the powerfully resonant title Zwoczani. Unlike Stars and Sand, which began with the biblical proof text, the scriptural basis for this title spoke for itself. It meant De Profundis, Min HaMeitzar, from the depths. It was a title that spoke both to the emotional substance of these poems and to their provenance. 3 of the 4 poets were Jews in hiding, and the 4th, a Polish Catholic, was, like them, a member of the political underground. Their true identities would be revealed only after the war. So to listen anthologically to these Polish poets, we don't need to know who would later remain in Poland, who would go into exile, and who would win a Nobel Prize for Literature. To listen anthologically, we need only attend to a wartime landscape scarred by walls, barbed wire, crematoria, and haunted by history. Song of a Jewish Boy. In that song, the poet, who went by the initials MJ, recalled this terrifying sight. When thirsty, from wired trains, with mouths like wounds, you cried for water. No one handed you water. And in the next poem, he wrote, "Here too, as in Jerusalem, there is the somber, wailing wall. Those who stood near it will see it no more." In this ravaged landscape, the Jews are ever present, whether they are mentioned by name or not, as in the unsigned poem that linked the burning ghetto to the Campo dei Fiori in 16th century Rome. I thought of the Campo dei Fiori in Warsaw by the sky carousel one clear spring evening to the strains of a carnival tune. The bright melody drowned the salvos from the ghetto wall, and couples were flying high in the cloudless sky. At times, wind from the burning would drift dark kites along, and riders on the carousel caught petals in midair. That same hot wind blew upon the skirts of the girls, and the crowds were laughing on that beautiful Warsaw Sunday. Someone will read as moral that the people of Rome or Warsaw haggle, laugh, make love as they pass by martyrs' pyres. Someone else will read of the passing of things human, of the oblivion born before the flames have died. It is a divided and morally fraught landscape which moves the poet to end on this defiant note. Those dying here, the lonely, forgotten by the world, our tongue becomes for them the language of an ancient planet, until, when all is legend and many years have passed, on a new Campo dei Fiori, rage will kindle at a poet's word. Before the mass martyrdom of Warsaw Jewry receded into memory, the poet issued a challenge to the future. Remember that the martyrs died alone, while we, the bystanders, continued to frolic. Multiply that challenge tenfold, and this anthology, issued from the depths, might rouse the conscience of the Polish people and provoke their struggle against the occupier. But there was no afterlife to From the Depths, even though a microfilmed copy was sent to London and from there to New York, where it was published with illustrations and an introduction in 1945, and it came out in a Hebrew translation in Tel Aviv a year later. Never again would Christians and Jews unite under the banner of the Polish Muse, neither in post-war Poland nor in the Polish diaspora. And in certain rarefied academic circles, even the question of writing poetry after Auschwitz would be called into question. Before the liberation of Auschwitz, however, there were prisoners who anguished over the question, who will speak for the millions of Jewish victims if there is no one left to bear witness? And so a group of young inmates from within the camp itself embarked on an anthological project to collect eyewitness accounts, poems, and stories in Yiddish and Hebrew, in prose and poetry. We alone must tell our story, wrote the editor on behalf of his fellow inmates. We alone must tell our story. The account we give in our writing is meant to record our tragedy, give an impression of it and represent it, but our powers fall short of the task. In no way can our writing be evaluated using standard literary measures, but instead finds justification in its documentary value. In fact, the introduction, the only part of the anthology that has survived, is itself a document of literary merit, and as such has been included in this excellent anthology of writing on the Holocaust, edited by Eric Sundquist. But however we listen to what it is saying, whether historically, forensically, psychologically, or culturally, first and foremost, it is speaking anthologically. This group of prisoners who did not expect to survive had banded together as one, tasked with the impossibility of speaking on behalf of those millions whose voices had been silenced forever. And so, the Jewish anthological imagination in the Holocaust came together in three different configurations. The voice of the many who spoke through the one, be it Zuckerman and Gutkovsky, Baron, or Chabas. The voice of the many who spoke in many voices, notably the Jews of Lodz, whether banding together voluntarily or struggling to survive in the ghetto. And the voice of the many, whether the last surviving Polish language poets in Warsaw or the last surviving Jewish inmates in Auschwitz, who spoke with one voice. Dear friends, if the first responders and first witnesses to the Holocaust have left us with such a rich and accessible legacy, then surely the time has come to train ourselves to listen anthologically to their individual and collective voices, and to listen chronologically from the beginning.